I'll
This
just jump right
conference
in
will
to
now
move
be
things
recorded.
along. Hi, everybody. It's so great to see everyone. Let's plan to get this in-house one time in this year, this calendar year. I think it's important. We've been a cohesive group, and we should think about moving everyone in the same room at least once a year, and this is the year to start it. So that's my advocation for this, and I'm glad to see everyone. I don't have any opening remarks. Chris?
We got a good one today. Every one of these meetings is a good one, of course, but we got a busy one today. We'll be considering the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, and then talking about some upcoming items, Advanced Clean Trucks and Building Energy Performance Standards in the briefings. All three of those are really significant measures for clean air and climate change. So looking forward to everyone's input and advice on these big topics.
Great. And I guess I'll just jump right to the minutes, Chris, unless you have something else.
Nope, let's get into it.
All right, so everyone was sent a copy of the minutes ahead of time. There was nothing too deep in the minutes, but has anyone had a chance to look at them and offer comments on the minutes? I'll give it 30 seconds to get people remind themselves that they have them in their inbox. MD is really good about sending them out. You have them and they're attached to the meeting, I think, but they're certainly in your email inbox. And just to remind themselves about the minutes. And then I'll ask for a motion to approve them in about 15 more seconds.
The file name is meeting notes, I think, correct?
Meeting minutes.
Mine says meeting notes April. Oh, the wrong one. Sorry, I'm in the wrong year. Wait a minute. No, I'm not.
Larry, you're making a few things that make you sound like you're close to my age. So
Yeah.
I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes if there's someone who else.
I move to approve. This is Sania. I move to approve.
Good morning.
Second.
Any second?
Second. Adrian Hollis.
All right. We'll just do it by assent. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Anybody want to be marked down as abstain? You know what I forgot to do was we didn't do an introduction who was on the phone. Randy, do you want to do that? Because you have the thing just to let everyone know who's on the phone, just quickly go down the attendance sheet. I think that's useful that people remind who's on here. Randy, is that something you can do?
Absolutely. Actually, Kelsey was going to read through the list for the council members. And
then I'll be quiet. And then it's not my meeting anymore.
Kelsey, could you please read, or is that Carolyn? I don't know.
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I can read off the council members who are here. So we have Adrian Hollis, Anna Marshall, Ben Hobbs. Hold on as I go down the list. Oh, I lost my spot. I apologize. Nicole Cook. Larry Schoen, Megan Latshaw, John Quinn, Robert Wright, Ross Salwich, Sonia Amir, Thomas Killeen, and Todd Chasen. If I missed anyone, please let me know.
Weston Young's here.
I apologize. Can't get down that far on my list. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelsey. Do we have a lot of guests on the phone, right?
Yes, we have 49 people here today.
And if people want to speak, we'll allow people to speak after the presentations and after discussion among the council. We'll let people that want to speak later as we deal with action items.
And John, this is Carolyn Jones, but I just wanted to announce that Sunni Park is also a council member and logged participating today. So that is everyone, 14 council members.
Thank you. All right, I'll turn it over to, I guess we'll move to the first action item, the Advanced Clean Car
And this would be Justin Mabry presenting for MDE.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Yep, we hear you.
All right, cool. I hate talking to myself, especially on camera. Yeah, today we're going to go over the Maryland Clean Cars program. You can go to the next slide, Randy. Some of this will be a refresher for many of you, as you know, we've updated this program numerous times since we adopted it in 2007. The Clean Cars Act of 2007 required the department to adopt California's stricter light-duty vehicle emission standards. It used to be called CalLEV, and then it was called Advanced Clean Cars, or ACC, and now with these updates, it's going to be known as Advanced Clean Cars 2, or ACC2. These regulations apply to new light-duty vehicles that are registered in Maryland. Next slide. As you may have heard, California has adopted new, more stringent standards. We'll get to what those standards are, but the changes only apply in Maryland to COMAR 2611-3402, which are the California regulations that MDE incorporated by reference. They build upon ACC1, which Maryland adopted in 2012. ACC1 covers model years 2015 through 2025. And just as a note, 17 other states have adopted all or part of California's LEV regulation. The ACC2 standards focus on increasing the number of zero-emission vehicles that vehicle manufacturers have to deliver to the state, while providing the flexibilities needed for the manufacturers to meet this more stringent program. Next slide. The ACC2 program does include emission standards for criteria pollutants from internal combustion engines. The standards are tweaked a little bit so that it can prevent any backsliding that could happen as a result of more ZEVs being in an OEM's fleet, or a vehicle manufacturer's fleet. The ACC2 program will cover model years 2027 through 2035 in Maryland. The standards were approved by CARB, the California Air Resources Board, back in August, and they were effective at the end of November, which is the date that we are going to use to update our incorporation by reference documents. Here's a bit of an overview of the program. This is a simple overview, as the program is quite large with lots of nuances as to how ZEV values or credits are calculated and when and how banked and earned credits can be used. CARB has tried to streamline much of the program to ease compliance, whereas years ago, regular hybrids and cleaner conventional gasoline vehicles could earn some portion of ZEV credits. Now only pure ZEVs like battery electrics and hydrogen fuel cells and plug-in hybrids that have at least 50 miles of all-electric range will earn ZEV credits. Some of the flexibilities, there are early action credits and historical credits from the current ACC1 program that will roll over into the new program, as well as a pooling mechanism that is similar to one that was in place for the last few years. This pooling allows vehicle manufacturers to move their credits from one state to another. So vehicles that were credits earned in New York could be used in Maryland and vice versa. One of the biggest changes to this program is that California wasn't really part of the pooling under ACC1, but they will be in ACC2. That will certainly provide some help to manufacturers to comply in the early years. Earned ZEV credits can be banked and traded to other manufacturers, and one important thing to note is that no vehicle manufacturer has been fined in Maryland or any other state that has California ZEV program for failing to meet the ZEV requirements. In fact, many manufacturers currently have a nice surplus of credits available in their ZEV accounts. Next slide. This slide shows some of the flexibilities that are available. I'm not going to go through all of this. I'll just say that if you look at the headings up top, the third column over, this shortfall required means that in order for those credits to be used, an OEM has to have a shortfall for the current year's requirements. So they can't just use up their historic credits and then bank their current earned credits for the future. Most of these flexibilities have a cap. You can see, 15% cap, and the pooling cap starts at 2025 for 2026, but it would be 20% for 2027 for Maryland, and then it goes down until 2030, and then it's phased out after that. Let's see. Yeah, and some of these do sunset around 2030. Early compliance credits sunset in 2028, but the PHEV credits and banked credits and trading do not sunset. You'll see that the PHEV credits, the third from the bottom, plug-in hybrids that get over 50 miles, as I said, can meet up to 20% of the requirement, and this doesn't expire. So even in 2035, up to 20% of the vehicles can still have an internal combustion engine in them. We can come back to the slide if there are any questions later, but we can move ahead. Here's a look at the ZEV requirements as it increases through the years. This does include 2026 because this is a slide from California, even though Maryland will not be able to enforce that year. You can see the benefit of the flexibilities in terms of how much they have the potential to reduce the actual percentage of new vehicle sales that must be ZEV. For instance, if an OEM fully exhausts all of the available flexibilities in 2027, they would need to place about 17% of their fleet be ZEVs in that year, with 20% of that potentially coming from plugins. So while the ZEV requirement for that year, shows 43%, they can comply with far fewer vehicles thanks to the flexibilities. As the flexibilities phase out, even with maxing out all the options, the requirements do get closer and closer, and by 2032, most of those flexibilities are gone. And as we creep closer to that 100% by 2035. Next slide. Okay, so the gap year, what happens with 2026? Maryland and several other states were unable to adopt these regulations by the end of calendar year 2020, meaning that we can't enforce the requirements in 2026 because of the 2-year lead time requirement that is required under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act. Maryland and these states will revert back to the federal EPA requirements in 2026. There are ongoing talks between the states and the OEMs on how best to handle this year, but for now we're treating 2026 as kind of a year where the OEMs can earn their early compliance credits if they were to place more vehicles than the regulation requires. So for 2025, the last year of AQCAC, the requirement is 7%. And the thinking right now is that we'd set 2026 at 7%, and if an OEM were to deliver more than 7% of their fleet as ZEVs for that year, they'll earn some early action credits. This should help ensure that Maryland still receives ZEVs during this gap year, as we believe the OEMs will want to earn those early credits to help them comply with the more stringent out years. And next slide. As for the next steps, MDE will adopt AQCAC through incorporation by reference. We're on schedule for it to be effective around September, the beginning of September 2023, so that we can enforce it starting with the 2027 model year. And I guess we'll take any questions.
Yeah, thanks, a great presentation. Do you mind if I'll just jump in with a couple questions I have? Could you talk about the process of, so we've had some legal requirement to adopt something from California for well over a decade and a half. Could you talk about that, and then how recently you've engaged others as we brought this before the council?
Yeah, we always have to adopt, or we have to update our regulation as California does to remain consistent. 2012 was a big update with AQCAC, where some of the ZEV requirements changed. Usually the changes that California does are minor, little adjustments here or just parts of the regulation that don't have a substantive effect on the program, but we still come before the council to get an update passed. This is obviously a bigger update going from ACC 1 to ACC 2, a more focus on ZEVs. So I'm not quite.
Hey, John.
I guess
Hey, Justin, I'll jump in too, John. This is Tim Shepard. And just to follow up what you said, John, correct. I think Justin's updated this reg 7 times now, and he's taken it to the council. So as Justin said, whenever California makes a change, we're required to make that change as soon as possible, because then you cannot create what's called a third program. So you can have a federal program or a California program. So we make these as soon as California makes some type of change. Justin makes it that year. Like I said, it's been done 7 times. And as was stated earlier, we have been in this program since we adopted in 07, began implementation in 11. Does that help, John? Maybe?
I just wanted to put it in the context for people, because there was a little bit of press at the end of last year about whether the previous Maryland administration was going to adopt it or was going to wait till this year. And I just wanted to kind of signify the way I understood that it's kind of routine to adopt the changes based on the 2007 law.
Right, yeah. Because it's in law, we are required to do it. There was a bit of a hesitation under the past administration, but we're moving full ahead now.
And have you had any pushback?
No. Most and the other states are pretty much said the same thing. I think, it's a little different than when we adopted a decade or more ago. The OEMs, most of the OEMs have already made announcements for their business plans for electrifying their entire fleet. And it kind of lines up with the requirements under ACC2. So we've been pleasantly surprised that the manufacturers have been pretty supportive. Basically they've been supportive, but say, of course, as part of this, you guys need to still keep incentives and develop infrastructure, et cetera. So, go ahead, Justin, sorry.
And I'll just note, we did forward a letter from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation to the council that came in on Friday that discussed some of those issues.
This is Ross Salvage. I don't see a hand raise. Is there a hand raise that I'm missing?
Yeah, I don't see one either. That's why I did this.
I was going to open it up to the council next. I'm sorry, Ross.
Okay, well, I'm ready. I have a question, but I didn't want to be rude. I just didn't.
It's not rude. I'm sorry. I should have identified. Yes, please go ahead, Dr. Salvage.
Okay, thanks. Nice to see everybody. My question is the I word, infrastructure. And being a EV driver myself, I'm greatly disappointed with the pace of the development of the infrastructure, and to just call it like it is, I think this is highly unrealistic without a plan for infrastructure. So hopefully we'll hear a plan for infrastructure as well. I mean, the pathetic part, and I don't use that word lightly, is the airports. All the local airports are truly pathetic.
So I guess I'll start, and then Tim, you have a better grasp of the numbers. The state, of course, does invest in EV charging infrastructure, and there are bills before the legislature this session that would increase the amount of investment. And also under the Inflation Reduction Act, the state is receiving about $65 million through the National Electric Vehicle Charging Infrastructure, or NEVI program, to supplement state funding to deploy more infrastructure. But Tim, maybe you could give more specifics on that.
Sure. Yeah, like Chris said, and I agree, infrastructure obviously is a need. All the agencies have been investing in infrastructure under VW. We contributed our maximum 15% that we were allowed under VW. That came to about $11.7 million or so in infrastructure. We've been focusing on workplace charging and level 3 corridor charging. We'll be doing our 3rd round. It's been a very popular program. It's been over applied to significantly in the first 2 rounds. MEA continues to do their programs through their regular rebate program for individuals and businesses, and they do offer additional programs for that. And then, as Chris said, under NEVI, NDOT will be receiving about $65 million for their focus is on corridor infrastructure. Basically, it has to be been within 1 mile or so of the corridor. I know we have a lot to go, but actually, I mean, Maryland is probably one of the better states on infrastructure right now. We've got just shy of 1,300 charging stations in the state for a total of just about 3,600 outlets, and that's not counting residentials and all. We do know there's going to be a continued push on that. Fortunately, on the federal program, there's a huge push to develop infrastructure. So we are moving in that direction. You know, we're seeing a lot more interest coming in from the businesses too. They used to require significantly more of a match to get them. They are now seeing, you know, more of their ability to put these in on their own. And we're seeing power levels increase, which will help the charging too. You know, it used to be the fast chargers we put in about 10 years ago were 50 kilowatts. Now we're putting in 180 kilowatt fast chargers. So we are seeing a lot of development. And of course, obviously the range of vehicles has gone up significantly. You know, a decade ago, we were looking at a range of 70 miles on electric. Now we're looking at 250 to 350 is becoming the norm more. So we are working on the infrastructure, but we do agree. And, you know, the airport is putting in some new chargers, but we are working on some of those, what would be kind of hubs where you can charge up. I don't know if that fully helps, but.
But it sort of helps, but what you never addressed, and I'm trying to be respectful and appreciative, and I'm with you for the need to do this, but I haven't heard of what's needed. You know, there's in the letter we got, and which I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about, they're talking about the ratio of, you know, chargers to cars. And again, you know, I just drive around and see so many EVs not plugged in at shopping centers. Other states, nearby shopping centers are way ahead of Maryland. I'm not going to name the other states. I will privately offline. And again, you know, if you think fighting for that one last parking spot these days over the holidays is an issue, just imagine if everyone is really driving an EV and only half of the spots are charged. Okay, well, if we have half of the spots where we could charge, that'd be a mecca. I mean, right now you have to, it's like finding the Easter egg to find charging at most local shopping centers.
Well, so we have to keep building, right? As we're deploying more EVs, we have to keep building. And right now we're at about an 18-to-1 ratio. One charger per 18 registered vehicles, one public charger per 18 registered vehicles. And the target, you know, we'd like to get that down to about 15-to-1. So that means we're going to have to keep on investing in more charging infrastructure, you know, which is what we're doing. And you know, everyone's driving habits and lifestyle are different. So, you know, different drivers have different experiences. I've been driving an electric car for about 6 years now, and I haven't had any trouble. But again, it all depends on, you know, where you go and how you use it. But no matter what, we need to keep building out for this transition. And between both state and federal dollars, we're expanding the investment.
Right. And
Chris, can I just make a comment on the charging of electric cars? We've had one for about 7 years, and 98% of the time it's charged at home. So, I mean, it gets about 275 miles, so on a charge. So 98% of the time we charge it at home.
Yeah. And I was actually going to add on that. What we certainly see a need for some of these public things, but right now studies show that 85% of all charging is done at either home or the workplace. So there's been a lot of focus to kind of cover what people want first as we start to build out the program. So as we deal with that, you know, residential and workplace charging, obviously corridors will play an important role and shopping centers. But right now, the interest from most EV drivers is workplace and residential.
Yeah, okay, and so sorry to monopolize, this will be it, and then I'm going to mute. Yes, and I do 98% of my charging at home, or high 90s, and that's because we have 2 cars in our family. And when we need to go 200 miles, we take the car that doesn't need a charge. And so again, you got to look below the horizon. For those who have just spoke, do 2 cars? And is that how you manage to get your high 90s? I can leave that as a rhetorical question. But, you know, we're talking a massive change, and I'm just deeply concerned we're not ready for it.
But
And
if just as chairman, that doesn't change your vote. You still think this is good to move forward with? Are you making a comment on that, or just a general comment?
no, it's, I'm very concerned that we're not ready to move forward. I mean, I thought I was going to see a huge change with the Volkswagen money. You know, I mean, in downtown Baltimore, they're few and far between. I know where to park my EV for the Ravens games, and there's 4. I'm one of 4.
Thank you. Dr. Latchell, I saw your hand up a few times.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to add on to, I mean, I am fully supportive of this. I think it's great. We need to move forward. This is the right direction. But I agree with, I think, some of Ross's sentiments, you know, and what was in the letter from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation is, you know, some people don't have the ability to have a charging station at home. Some people don't even have a job to charge at their job. And so, you know, the potential impact on, you know, the people in the state who can't afford some of what others can, I think is important to think about. And then the other piece that I would like to see MDE do is engage maybe in some conversations with the BGE or Constellation about the grid. I think that's an important point that they made, and also about building codes. And you know, so not just thinking about the words of this regulation, but thinking about the impacts beyond this regulation and having conversations about that. But I do support it.
I don't really, this is my failing, but Kelsey or Randy, is there a place where people can raise their hand digitally, or they just have to do it on screen?
Yeah, I don't think there's a place for us
All
to
right. I
have
see a lot
hands
of
raised,
faces
yeah.
on here. Put your hand, I see Dr. Hobbs. Go next, please.
Thank you. Just a procedural question. We're going to have public comments on this agenda item after our discussion?
Yes, we're going to invite others. I just thought we'd have a discussion here and then move it beyond this group.
It's possible that's even likely that something will come up during discussion that the council will then want to discuss. So we'll have an opportunity to circle back and have further discussion if appropriate, if we need to.
Yes, sir.
Okay. It just seems to me that maybe we could have had the public comment before the discussion. That might have been more efficient. But at any rate, okay.
Just how we've managed it in the past is we have a minor discussion here, then we open it up to the rest. I apologize if I didn't make it clear at the beginning. Anybody else want to speak now? Mr. Schoen.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Good to see everyone. So yeah, I agree with everything that's been said. This is an area of transportation where we generate a lot of emissions statewide and certainly nationwide. And I've always wanted us to enlarge the discussion, but it's much broader than EV charging stations. It has to do with development trends and the reliance on single occupancy vehicles that in the world that we've created. The response sort of over the years is, yeah, but we have a very limited area in which we work in this council and the MD. So I am supportive of this change. I guess I would like to know a little bit more about the letter from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. They do mention building codes, but they also mention hydrogen vehicles. Is that addressed, and is that expected to be a player in the zero emissions of vehicles realm?
Did you say hydrogen vehicles?
Yeah, they do mention hydrogen.
Yeah, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are, they're a zero emission vehicle technology, so they do earn credits. We've had issues with hydrogen vehicles outside of California. The infrastructure is, outrageously expensive, to be blunt. Orders of like $1.5 million per station plus. So it's been hard to generate, to have the funds to put that in there just to get the vehicles here. It's been a barrier that we've just had a hard time getting across. California puts hundreds of millions of dollars into their hydrogen fuel cell infrastructure every year, and we just don't have that, honestly.
So it's not
Yeah,
expected.
follow what Justin said.
In Maryland is what I'm hearing.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
what?
Not expected to be a significant player in Maryland.
We don't
Not-
know. It
yeah.
depends on the direction the technology goes. But in any case, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles are eligible to be credited under this regulation. It would treat them like a battery electric vehicle. So they're included in the program.
And we've had discussion, it's been added as a new thing to the ZVIC, Zero Emission Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Council run by MDOT. They have a hydrogen fuel station provider, manufacturer. We've worked with OEMs to see how we can develop the infrastructure, but they really want the states to put in a large chunk of the funding, incentives to cover it, and it's just we focus more on something we could do with battery electrics and putting in fast chargers, because a fast charging station can be $100,000 to $150,000 versus $1.5 million.
I don't see any other questions. Anybody else have a question before we go to, go ahead, Mr. Wright.
Yes, with regard to hydrogen fuel cells, no one's going to do this at home. So, and I doubt if there are many public places. So it really is an issue. I'm for this passing this, but I don't know how we're going to accommodate fuel cells. A fleet operation could handle. So it is an interesting question, and it's all part of the legislation, but it's not something that people are going to do at home.
Great. I suggest we go to the floor and see if there's outside speakers would like to speak. Is that all right with everyone? But Randy or Kelsey, has anyone signed up to speak?
I have not.
I just saw a no pop up. I'm sorry, I don't know how to use GoToMeeting. I just saw a no pop up.
I see that too. I apologize if I am saying your name wrong. Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, please introduce yourself. What's your comment?
Oh yeah, no problem. So I'm an associate attorney at the Sierra Club, and I just wanted to comment in favor of the council supporting Maryland's adoption of the Advanced Clean Cars Rule. So first of all, Maryland's Clean Cars Act of 2007 requires the state to adopt California's vehicle standards, including this rule, as was noted earlier. And adopting this rule is critical for complying with the Climate Solutions Now Act's requirement that Maryland reduce greenhouse gas emissions 60% by 2031. And I'll just note this rule is also critical for protecting public health, as switching to zero emission electric cars will reduce air pollution like nitrogen oxides that contribute to asthma and other health issues. And as noted previously, 17 other states have already adopted the Advanced Clean Cars Rule, and a number of global car companies, including Ford, Toyota, General Motors, and Honda, have made public statements in support of the Advanced Clean Cars Rule. And more funding for chargers is becoming available with additional funds under the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So I think chargers can and should be built out in tandem with increasing public adoption of electric vehicles under this rule. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Are there any other people in the audience that we can't see that would like to speak?
Yeah, to manage it, why don't we, for anyone who'd like to speak, please type your name into the chat box, like Sari did. And
we have another one in the chat, Mr. Kevin Shen.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yep, we
Yes.
hear you, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, hello, council members. My name is Kevin Chen. I'm a policy analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists. We're a science-based advocacy organization fighting for a sustainable and just future. I just wanted to uplift again support for the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule. Pollution from mobile sources in Maryland are the largest contributing source category for both Maryland's ozone and climate change issues. Maryland in the past has adopted, has been a leader with adopting policies such as California's Clean Car Standards, and those have contributed to so much of the ozone improvements in recent years. These new vehicle standards would help Maryland's ozone attainment goals, as well as just benefit the health of the state's residents. And so we can't leave these policies on the table. And then lastly, I just want to put a small mention in for, you may not have heard of, for the future discussion on heavy duty vehicles, but you may not have heard much on the heavy duty low NOx omnibus rule, but I just want to make sure that's in your minds. This would help reduce NOx emissions from diesel engines by over 90% starting in 2027. And there have been multiple studies that show technical feasibility with new engine technologies for this transition. But I just wanted to make sure that this was all on your minds. So thanks so much. And I hope you help push for policies that clean our air. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. I'll let Kelsey manage them all if there's more people.
Looks like we are good to go. There's no more.
All right, I see Mr. Schoen would like to ask another question.
Yeah, so this is not so much a question as a comment and an item for thought. So I'm looking at the charge of AQCAC, and it's not only to review and advise on draft air quality rules, but there's a second bullet, at least on the website. It says evaluating as requested by the department state level measures to meet air quality standards. And it goes on to talk about legislation and strategic plans. So I'm going to interpret the distribution of the letter from the and the overall discussion as essentially a request from the department. And I've heard a number of comments that talk about other state level measures related to the charging infrastructure that are needed to meet the goal of this regulation. And so whoever's going to make the motion or might want to make a follow-up motion to recommend that state level measures to improve the infrastructure be done by, I guess, the other groups and building codes and other state authorities. Just a thought.
Just as a matter of order, you want that to be part of a motion about approving this regulation?
I'm suggesting that the people who've been advocating for that, and I agree with the advocacy for a better infrastructure for charging, that might want to consider a follow-up motion or make it part of the motion. I'm not
Can
sure
I keep it clean and do that in two different tranches? We'll do this one, then you can make that motion second.
That sounds like a good strategy. I don't have the wording crafted, but maybe we can work on that in the background.
Let's say on this current regulation, are there other comments or concerns? So I'm happy. Oh, go ahead, Mr. Wright.
Yes, I'd like to move that we adopt the Advanced Clean Car Act amendments, COMAR 26.11.34.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Dr. Amir. All in favor? Oh, any further discussion? All right, all in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Are there any opposition? Any abstentions? Thank you so much. I think it's an obvious one, but I think we came up with a lot of points. Larry, Mr. Schoen, do you want to come up with another motion about advocacy for infrastructure advancement?
Well,
Our recommendations that the state move towards more accelerated infrastructure advancement?
That's the general sense of it. I don't have a coherent draft at the moment, so I don't know if you want to others have thought about it and thought about some wording, or if you want to move on and then maybe we come back to this.
If I could add a bit of context that may be helpful, there was mention earlier of ZVIC. That's another state council, the Zero Emissions and Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Council, that exists to advance EV infrastructure and other electric and other ZEV infrastructure projects throughout the state. So we have that other council that is specifically constituted to address that.
Right, but the question,
we could send a note from this council.
I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
We could send a note from this council to them that we approve this, but we advise them to move as quickly as possible on infrastructure advancement.
I mean, the question is, would action by the council have an impact larger in the state? In those other groups, in building codes were mentioned.
I'd be willing to work with the department to send a letter from the council to EVIC suggesting we pass this, and it works best if infrastructure advances as quickly as possible. And if I could get the council's approval to move forward and use the council's name on that joint letter from the department, I'd be happy to work with Chris. Would you think that was okay?
We'd be happy to work with the council on that.
And John, is that something that could be circulated in draft form? Because I heard some pretty strong language from some of the people advocating for this.
Dr. Salowitz, does that
sounds great? Yes, sounds great. Thanks.
So we'll do that, and we'll circulate it within 2 weeks. It'll be in your hands, and I'll ask the department to help me with that, and everyone will get a chance to review it.
As somebody, just one sort of add-on comment, as somebody who works in the building codes area, there is a general sort of rule in building codes that you can continue to operate a building in its current form, generally, with some exceptions. For instance, an exception would be an imminent structural failure or a big safety issue. But in general, a building owner is allowed to continue to operate the building without having the buildings department come back and say, you have to do this to upgrade your building. So a way to advance the infrastructure would be something like financing program from the state that would allow building owners to invest $150,000 to put the charging station. Presumably, there would be income available from that charging from the owners and from the users who own the vehicles. So there might be some creative ways to advance this process, and I guess I'd be happy to be part of a discussion about that if there's a broader discussion, as somebody who works in the building codes area and who works on green building standards as well.
Well, how about also involving multiple agencies in the state? Beside the building code, there is also the DOT. There are, other agencies which are affected by the infrastructure, or they are overseeing the infrastructure in general, and they could be part of all this. Rather, the letter should address that MDE will be working, I don't know, in synchrony, but in along parallel or in conjunction with all the other, and the other can participate, and that makes it much easier. Even applying for grant to improve,
I did want to add to this conversation, listening in on the ZVIC conversations, one of the biggest issues seems to be multifamily residential. And when they get built, unless the county has a requirement, I do agree. I think an incentive program would help, and it would make the rental units more appealable. But it's really difficult for a person, if they are living in a multifamily residential complex, to buy a zero emission vehicle unless their work offers some sort of charging. So that seems to be one of the topics ZVIC frequently comes back to, in terms of, okay, that's usually controlled at the county level. And I think if there was a model ordinance that the Maryland Association of Counties could pass on or something of that nature, I think that would help. But just wanted to add that.
Chris, if I might, and then I'll go back to Larry. there's a lot going on in this space that I don't have the firsthand details, but just so everyone knows, it crosses, I just don't have time to inject in all of it. Maybe a 15-minute presentation at the next AQCAC about all the infrastructure things going on would be worthwhile. There's a lot of money flowing into the state. A lot of people are having efforts to accelerate this, including the utilities and including the Department of Transportation. It's just not something we've dealt with. So if I might ask the department to put that on the agenda, short, not like an hour, just a 15-minute on all the things going on in infrastructure. And I just saw you shaking your head, Chris.
Sure thing. Yeah, we're happy to do that for the next meeting as a briefing item. We can draw on the latest from ZVIC and MDOT with the federal money, and by then we'll have the legislative session will be over. So we'll also be able to talk about, you know, what passed this year addressing funding. So I agree. Thank you. We can put that together.
Mr. Schoen?
So I'm on that question of state versus localities. Yes, it's true that localities, the counties and city, enforce the building codes, and I'm not an expert on legal authorities that are transmitted from the state to the counties, but I know that there are some things related to buildings that are statewide, that although it's enforced locally, you have to do it according to state law. So for instance, elevators and escalators. You can't build a Howard County escalator that has less safety features than a Baltimore County elevator escalator. So there is some authority. There must be some authority at the state level to promulgate building code regulations.
Yeah, I'll just add that.
Multiple people are trying to. Kelsey, are you monitoring who's asking to speak in the text?
Yeah, we don't have any other commenters, just a comment about the letter from Megan, but that's about it.
And what did that say?
She stated the letter suggested every new unit in a MUD with available parking has at least one EV ready parking.
Thank you. And I see Mr. Colleen's hands up.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to speak. Larry, I'm a bit confused about the building code thing. Anytime that you would have to do any kind of electrical work, you'd have to pull a permit through the municipality, I'd say the county, that electrical charging stations are being installed. So I'm kind of confused about your building permit question.
Well, let me give you an example. If in the MDE building on the third floor, they want to put in a new electric panel to handle a computer, an addition of a computer or something, addition of a few more offices, that does not necessarily trigger an upgrade of the entire building to the current building code. And so requiring for a minor electrical permit, a major upgrade is generally not done. That's the point of what I was saying.
Well, Mr. Chasen, I hear you.
I think you're about to say exactly what I was going to say, Mr. Chairman.
Please, I'll let you do it.
I was simply going to suggest that this has been a very good conversation. I think we have some fruitful action items, but I want to make sure that we don't short ourselves on the other important agenda items that we have.
And we're going to work on a letter suggesting infrastructure development, and then we're going to get the presentation at a future AQCAC meeting. Thank you for the great discussion on this, and thanks for your comment, Todd. Are we ready to move on to the next agenda item? I think, Mr. Shepherd, you're up.
Yep. Thanks, John. I'll wait for the slides.
Sorry, Tim.
It's okay.
Brought up the wrong thing. There we go.
There we go. We ready?
Ready.
Yeah, my name is, sure, thanks. My name is Tim Shepard. I'm a division chief in the Mobile Sources Control Program. I'm just going to talk a little bit today about a couple new programs on the horizon on the medium heavy duty sector side that kind of complement what Justin had just spoken about on the light duty side. The first slide is a little similar, obviously. Basically, all new vehicles, whether it be light, medium, or heavy, have to meet certification standards set by either California or EPA. only allowed either of those two options. California is the only state allowed to set these new standards other than federal. And under Section 177 of the Clean Air Act allows other states like Maryland to adopt California's emission standards as long as they are identical. Next slide, please. For medium heavy duty regs, California currently has more stringent emission standards for medium heavy duty vehicles. When Maryland adopted the Clean Car Program in 2007, this was not under that legislation, so we did not adopt those standards. So we still had the federal standards for medium heavy duty and California for light duty. Recently, California has updated their regulations and strengthened emission requirements for all medium heavy duty vehicles. This covers class 2B through class 8. And the two programs I'm here to discuss today are the Advanced Clean Truck Regulation, which is basically similar to what Justin talked about a ZEV mandate for medium heavy duty trucks. It will require an increasing percentage of medium heavy duty vehicles sold in Maryland to be zero emission. And then the other topic I'm going to talk about, which was mentioned briefly by the gentleman from Union of Concerned Scientists, is the heavy duty omnibus regulations, which specifically targets NOx emissions. Next slide, please. A little background, again, why are medium heavy duty trucks an important area that we need to address? In Maryland, medium and heavy duty trucks are the second largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the state, in the Northeast, actually, just behind, again, light duty vehicles. And as you can see, medium heavy duty trucks are projected to increase their emissions compared to, say, light duty, which are going down. Next slide. And then on NOx emissions, again, a pretty similar story. On-road diesel heavy-duty vehicles are the second leading contributor in the Northeast for NOx. And as we all know, NOx is still an important concern in the entire region with ground level ozone. Next slide, please. So that brings me first to the Advanced Clean Truck Program. Right now, there are two pieces of legislation in Maryland session that would require Maryland to adopt the program. They're House Bill 230 and Senate Bill 224. As they are currently standing right now, both of these would require us to adopt the Advanced Clean Truck Rule for model year 27, which would be by January of 2026. As Justin mentioned before, we have to have 2-year model lead time before we can adopt. MDE can use existing authority, or we can use specific enabling legislation, which is what I just mentioned. The legislation right now is going through various amendments. MDE is monitoring it. Obviously, a bit out of our hands. We're going to see how everything goes. It did clear the Senate about a week and a half ago, and it's in the House right now. So we are tracking that, but again, we'll see how that goes. As most of you are familiar with legislation, there are amendments being added and subtracted. So we'll see what the final outcome of that bill is, and if there is legislation passes. And again, if we were to adopt or be required to adopt, we would do this through incorporation by reference, the same way that we've done the ACC program over the years. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, the ACT basically requires medium heavy duty truck manufacturers to sell an increasing percentage of their vehicles in the state be ZEVs. This can be hydrogen, it could be electric, it just has to be a zero emission vehicle. The ZEV sales for California, when they adopted, the ZEV sales began in 2024 and they increased through 2035. For Maryland, obviously we would come in a couple years late, but we would come in at that whatever that year requirement would be. And I'll show you that in a second. Next slide. As I mentioned, different truck classes will have different ZEV requirements. Class 2B through 3 begins at 5% and increases up to 55% by model year 2035. Class 4 through 8 begin at 9% and they'll increase up to 75% for 2035. And then class 7 through 8, those are big heavy duty tractors, will begin at 5% and they'll increase to 40% by 2035. That should be 2035 actually, but it begins in 2032. This program has a similar banking and credit system as the light duty vehicle program did. Next slide. And this might be a little tough to read, but this is the percentages for each truck category. As you can see, like I said, it starts at 5, 9, and 5%. If Maryland were to come in at 2027, that's highlighted. We'd come in at 15% for class 2B through 3, 20% for class 4 through 8, and then 15% for 7 through 8 tractors. As I said, even though we'd be coming late into the program, we don't come in at the earlier standards. We come in at whatever year it is. Next slide. This chart gives you a little better idea of what each of these vehicles are. Feel free to look at that. As you can see, your class 2B through class 3 are your step trucks, your UPS stuff, your more built on truck platforms too, like the E1, the Ford E350 and stuff like that. And then it goes all the way up. But again, it would cover all these categories in different phases. Next slide. So that was again on the ZEV requirement, and that's the ACT program. An additional program that Maryland is looking at would be the California Heavy Duty Omnibus Regulation. The Omnibus Regulation is a separate regulatory action compared to ACT, so they are separate. You can adopt one or the other. You don't have to adopt both of them at the same time. You can only adopt one. Many states have gone different routes. California finalized this rule in 2021. The Omnibus Regulation will ultimately require a 90% reduction in NOx emissions. Basically, we're going to go from 0.2 grams per NOx brake horsepower down to 0.02. So it's a significant decrease. CARB does this in a two-phase program. It begins with an incremental phase at 0.05. That goes to 2026. And then the 0.02 is started in 2027, and it's fully phased in across all vehicles by 2031. CARB will also update the requirements to ensure real-world emission performance meets the regulatory requirements. That's always a concern. And then as a bonus to the consumer, under this rule, it lengthens the existing emission warranty. So it provides a little more security to the purchaser that this equipment, if there's any problems, is covered under warranty for a much longer time than the current emission equipment. Next slide, please. Again, similar ACT, the earliest we could adopt would be by the end of this calendar year, which would mean we would get in we would begin implementation in January 2nd, 2026, which would capture the 2027 model year. MDE again could use existing authority or through enabling legislation. Currently, there is no legislation being proposed in session like there is under ACT. And again, we would adopt this through incorporation by reference, the same way we've done the previous California programs. Next slide, please. So where's the EPA on this issue? EPA has just recently updated their heavy duty emission standards. It's called the Clean Truck Program. On December this past year, EPA released the final Clean Truck Rule. It is similar to the Omnibus, and it will begin implementation in 2027. Next slide. Obviously, a question is, how does this compare to the Omnibus Rule? There's a couple key differences. As I mentioned, the Omnibus is broken up into two levels of stringency, up to 2027 and then 2031 onward. The Clean Truck Program requires one set of standards in 2027, and it has no changes after that. So it's pretty much a flat or static program. The lowest requirement under the Clean Truck Program is 0.035 grams per NOx brake horsepower. As you can see, that's a little higher than what we're seeing under the Omnibus at 0.02. And again, it's unfortunately not as an easy comparison of, oh, one's stricter on all the things. There are differences, such as the length of time for emission requirements and so forth in different vehicle classes. So it's not as easy to compare like apples to apples. But when you look at the program as a whole, we view the NOx omnibus rule as being stronger than the clean truck program. One of the areas that has specifically given some concern under the clean truck program is under the clean truck program, they've introduced basically a temperature adjustment function for emissions, which basically will relax the NOx standard at ambient temperatures below 25 degrees Celsius, which is about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're not talking significantly low temperatures, we're talking fairly normal temperatures for this region. That is a big concern with a lot of the states because these requirements would basically take that 0.035 and bump that up to about 0.005. So it is a big jump. So there is discussions about trying to see if EPA would backtrack on that. I don't think they probably will, but they're going to, they are taking comments, but they'll finalize everything by the spring and move forward with that. So when you look at the two programs, that's really one of the key differences that's giving a lot of concern on this. So that's the omnibus rule. Next slide, I think that's it. Yep. So I'll be glad to take questions. I know that was a lot to cover in a short amount of time, and I probably went fairly quick through that. So again, thank you.
You did a great job, and I thank you for it. So, but the 2 points I got were that you need legislation to do this, and the second point is you're not asking for an action at this time. Are they both correct?
Correct. And like I said, we are monitoring the legislation on ACT. So go ahead, Chris.
I think we may have misheard, John. We do not need legislation to do this. We have existing authority, but there is legislation moving for advanced clean trucks. And we would, from the department's perspective, we would welcome authorizing legislation to firm that up. But we do not need legislation. We have the existing authority.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah, John, sorry. And just as an FYI, there are several states right now. There are 6 states that have adopted the ACT program. In addition to obviously California, it's Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Washington State, and Oregon. And then there's additional states that are looking to adopt this year or next year.
I saw Dr. Latchall's hand up.
I was just going to ask, so when our next meeting is, do we meet every other month? Is that right? I'm just trying to think if the legislation doesn't pass, when will we be able to vote to do it, on whether or not we think we should do it under the California?
The department meets quarterly. So we have our meetings typically scheduled out for March, June, September, and December.
So we'll meet in June next, which would be after the session is over. So we could vote then. Okay.
Should the department move forward with our proposal at that point. Correct.
Or we'd also obviously update you on the legislation, which if it passes, we'd be moving to implement.
Anyone else's hand up? If not, I'll jump in. It begs the question, is that in the department's list of things they may do?
Yes.
Okay,
whether the legislation passes or not, we hope to bring advanced clean trucks and omnibus to you all for consideration at the June meeting. Nothing's final until it's final, but
I understand. No, that gives us an indication.
Yep.
Is there anything in here about black carbon emissions?
No.
Okay. And so we're like going off of these other standards and not putting our own in, but black carbon emissions are kind of a big deal as well. So it'd be good to consider that at the appropriate time. And just Chris, you probably have heard this from Russ Dickerson, but one of the items that we found in our academic studies is that black carbon emissions went down tremendously during COVID because of no stop and go traffic. So this is a whole infrastructure issue as well as, regulating the emissions. It's basically the turbo lag in the diesel engines that appears to be the culprit, and that paper is now published. So thanks.
I don't see any other hands, and we don't have an action item. Are we Is there anyone in the audience that's expressed an interest in speaking on this topic?
We don't have anything in the chat, so.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Shepherd. I think
Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone.
Let's move on to the next agenda item, please.
Okay, and we have Mark Stewart up to speak on the building energy performance standards.
Good morning, everybody. Quick sound check. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Good to be back in front of AQCAC. Mark Stewart, Climate Change Program Manager at MDE. I'm going to give you a little bit of a recap on what we discussed in December regarding these building energy performance standards. But the most important note up front is that these are not proposed regulations that we're bringing to AQCAC today for any decision. This is just an informational item to help lay the groundwork for the proposed regulation down the road. Just trying to make sure that we're keeping you updated and up to speed on all of the moving parts with this regulation. So I'll start with a little recap on the December briefing, and then today I'm going to share some information with you, including the location and the distribution of covered buildings, the process that building owners would go through when complying with the regulation, some preliminary results that we have in terms of the emissions and energy impacts, and then a summary of some of the input that we heard from stakeholders last fall when we had information and listening sessions about the forthcoming rule. Next slide. So a quick recap on what I presented to you in December. The Maryland statute requires that buildings that are larger than 35,000 square feet or more, excluding a parking garage area, will comply with these regulations. There are a few categories of exempt buildings. I didn't bother to list them out here, but K-12 schools, agricultural buildings, certain historic properties, so on and so forth, are exempt from this regulation. We estimate that there are approximately 9,000 buildings statewide that are covered. We are still working to refine the final list of covered buildings and may have an update on that by June. The law requires that it's a two-target system. First, that buildings will need to achieve a net direct greenhouse gas emissions reduction. The law requires that a covered building achieve a 20% reduction in net direct greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero direct emissions by 2040. The law also requires that MDE in its rulemaking set energy use intensity targets for buildings. And as I think I shared with you previously, and based on the input that we've received from stakeholders, we're leaning strongly toward setting those based on site energy use intensity, which is really bringing it within the locus of control for the building owners. We're very fortunate to be working with the U.S. Department of Energy, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Pacific Northwest National Lab, Institute for Market Transformation, and Northeast Energy Efficiency partners in the development of this regulation. Those are our technical assistance partners, a few of which are on the line today to provide the technical support for me when I need it. Thanks. So where are the buildings in Maryland? This map shows the locations for the buildings that we've identified so far. As you can see, and not surprisingly, these large buildings are primarily clustered along major highway corridors. You can see, you can almost make out the I-95 corridor running through Maryland, of course, 495 and 270. And then you see clusters of larger buildings in our urban areas. In the east, we've got a cluster in Salisbury and Ocean City, and then toward the west, Frederick, Hagerstown, and Cumberland. But we do see a distribution of covered buildings in every county statewide. So this is very much a regulation that will have some impact on buildings across the state. Next slide. Warehouses are the most typical type of covered buildings in Maryland. We see warehouses, office buildings, multifamily residential buildings, and retail stores being the most common covered buildings. As we do further analysis on the covered buildings, we'll be able to provide a greater sort of insight into what exactly these buildings look like, but this is just a quick snapshot that we wanted to share with you all today. Next slide. So what's the process? What's a covered building owner need to do? First, they would use a tool called the EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager. It's a software, it's free for everyone to use. One of my colleagues just benchmarked his own house a couple weekends ago using this tool. So I encourage you to dabble in it. If you don't already track your personal energy consumption at home using it, you can. So this is a tool that a couple of thousand building owners in Maryland already use to track their energy consumption. So it's a widely used tool across the country. The regulation would require, beginning in 2025, that every covered building owner would use this tool, and at least one time annually, they would record their energy use. The tool calculates the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that energy consumption, and then shares with the building owner, here is your energy use intensity, here are your emissions. At the same time, they would look at their energy use intensity and their emissions level and compare it with the standards for the 2030s to 2040 timeframe that we'll be publishing in the regulation. And then having to determine, is there anything that I need to do to improve the energy performance of my building to meet the energy performance standards? So that's what you see in that middle column of assessing, right? Is there anything that I need to do to improve the energy performance of my building? We estimate about 1 in 4 covered buildings are already all electric or use a trivial amount of on-site fuel, direct fuel use for combustion on-site. Regarding the emissions standard, about 25% of covered buildings are already likely in compliance with the final emission standard of net zero direct emissions by 2040. So there's that assessment. Is there anything that we need to do to improve the energy performance? And then starting in 2030, they'll need to have their energy use intensity and emissions level from their building be under the standards for those years. They can come into compliance. The law requires that we create an alternative compliance pathway to allow a covered building owner to pay a fee for any emissions that are above target levels to come into compliance. So that's what the law called the alternative compliance payment option. Next slide. So I'm going to walk through at a higher level than LBNL would do it themselves, some slides that were produced by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. This is a preliminary energy and emissions impact assessment of this forthcoming regulation. So at a high level, essentially, what LBNL has done for us is taken our covered building list and a lot of building data, including from the state's tax database, the input from various buildings that are using the portfolio manager tool currently, so on and so forth. I'll actually get into a little bit more detail on the next slide, and put together in their model a building stock of the covered buildings in Maryland, and then couple that with various target scenarios to say, okay, well, if this building stock achieved these levels of reductions, what would that mean in terms of their energy and emissions impact looking out into the future? Next slide. So some of the data sources they used were, of course, our preliminary covered building list, which includes about 8,500 buildings, some site EUI, that's energy use intensity, EUI is the shorthand, from EPA data, ratio of fuel used for space heating and water heating from Comstock and ResStock, projected grid emissions factors. The current projection that we're using, just so you know, in terms of anticipating how clean does Maryland's electricity supply become in the future, we're currently using Maryland's 2030 GGRA plan projections for that. Of course, as you all know, our climate laws were updated just a few months ago, we're working this year to also develop the state's next GHG reduction plan, which could include new clean power initiatives that would accelerate the pace of Maryland's decarbonization of the electric grid. As those policies also become clear, that has impacts on the effect of electrification strategies for buildings, for vehicles, which you all had a good discussion about over the last hour. Basically, the emissions benefits of all of these electrification measures become more robust the faster we decarbonize the grid. LBNL also used, for their preliminary analysis, some energy use intensity targets that were developed by another consultant called Stephen Winters and Associates for Montgomery County. Montgomery County is the jurisdiction in Maryland that already has a benchmarking program and already has a requirement to create a building performance standard similar to the state's. So they're many years ahead of us actually on working with covered building owners, with stakeholders in the county to determine, the most sensible path forward for covered buildings to have to comply with the building performance standard. And then the model basically treats the changes to buildings in this way. First, it tries to meet the direct emissions targets through basic efficiency measures. And then it electrifies the space heating, water heating, and other uses until the direct emissions target is met. And then finally, if the building doesn't achieve the standards based on those two features, then it reduces electricity consumption. So it's improving electrical efficiency in order to meet the EUI target. So next slide shows the results of the preliminary analysis from LBNL. Quick orientation here, you see energy impacts on the left and emissions impacts on the right. So starting on the energy impact side, the red line across the top is your reference case scenario. Essentially, if there were no targets, then the model is expecting that total energy consumption in buildings essentially remains flat until 2040, through 2040. And then as the model layers in the direct emissions targets, you see a decrease of about a 10% decrease in total energy consumption between 2025 and 2040. And then it layers in assumed site energy use intensity targets, and then you see a much more significant decrease in energy consumption. Really quick note, this is a preliminary analysis. If any of you participated in some of the stakeholder meetings last fall, you might have seen these slides already. We shared these with the utilities and district energy providers, I think back in November. So we're still working with the national labs and our technical assistance partners to refine all of these numbers as we work toward setting targets in the rulemaking. So on the emission side, the reference case, there you see emissions trailing off in the future, even in the reference case, pretty dramatically. And that's because the majority of energy use in buildings is electrical consumption, right? So as the grid gets cleaner, our buildings are naturally are decarbonizing because of the decarbonization of the grid itself. You see further emissions reductions as we reduce direct emissions through the regulation and then decrease or improve overall energy efficiency as well. The next slide here shows just the cumulative impact on the emissions. So with no targets, the reference case would have commercial buildings or these covered buildings producing, this winds up being about 50 million metric tons of CO2 between 2025 and 2040. By layering in direct emissions targets first, that pulls it down closer to about 40 million metric tons cumulative emissions over that time frame. And then by also increasing overall energy efficiency, that pulls it down toward about 30 million metric tons of CO2e over the course of the next decade and a half for these covered buildings in Maryland. Next slide. And then drilling in a little bit more, this is now looking at what are the impacts on natural gas consumption in the covered buildings and electric consumption in these buildings. So on the left side, we have with direct emissions targets only, you see an increase in electricity consumption as those fossil fuel end uses are moving toward efficient electrification. You see an increase of about 5.8% between 2025 and 2040. And then on the right side, what you see is by focusing also on overall energy consumption and energy efficiency, you can achieve significant overall electrical savings. So this model, using some assumed targets, decreases total electricity consumption about 44% between 2025 and 2040, while also driving natural gas consumption in the covered buildings to about 0. Now, important to note, the model is assuming driving natural gas consumption in these covered buildings to 0 by 2040. The law, because of its creation of the alternative compliance pathway and allowing building owners to pay for any emissions that are above target levels, the law is not an electrification mandate. It doesn't require a total elimination of on-site fossil fuel use. It's just saying that by 2040, if a building is using any on-site fuel, then the building owner will pay the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions associated with using that fuel on site. So that's how the legislature wrote the law. Next slide. The takeaway from this slide is essentially that LBNL looked at a number of variations to their model, basically running a sensitivity analysis in a number of ways. And the bottom line is that the overall results don't change significantly based on any of the sensitivity runs that they did. So anyhow, some assuredness in their model. And then next slide. So we met with 14 different stakeholder groups in kind of large open stakeholder meetings between November and December. You can see listed on the slide here the categories of building owners that we met with through this process. It was a very engaged group, and actually I'll say, let's advance to the next slide, which I think gives a little bit more of a breakdown. We had more than 400 people attend those meetings, representing more than 300 different organizations. Each meeting was attended with between 25 and 110 people per meeting, so good representation. We received a lot of feedback. We issued a questionnaire following these stakeholder meetings and collected a lot of written comments from stakeholders. We of course reviewed those and have kept all of that in mind as we've worked through this rulemaking internally. Next slide. And of course, we heard a number of questions and concerns from stakeholders. Stakeholders wanting clarity on what exactly the net direct emissions targets and the EUI targets will be. Wanting more clarity around the definition of a covered building, and wanting to know, if there's going to be more clarity on any buildings or types of energy use in buildings that are exempt from these standards. We heard wanting flexibility on backup power and electric vehicle charging. One thing that I think we heard from almost every stakeholder, perhaps every stakeholder, is that, and linking back to the good conversation that you all had in the first hour of the meeting, everyone felt across the board that the energy consumption for electric vehicle charging should not be included in this regulation, right? So if a building may, as it adds more EV charging on site, increase its electricity consumption. And we do not want that increase of electric consumption for electric vehicle charging to disadvantage the building from achieving the energy use intensity standards in the regulation. So I can say that we're leaning very, very heavily toward including an exemption of EV charging for all buildings for the energy use intensity standard within the regulation. And of course, one very important piece of recommendations that we heard from the stakeholders was wanting very close state local government coordination. And this is really born out of the fact that we've got Montgomery County that's already developing its own building energy performance standards. We have many covered buildings in Montgomery County that may have to comply with both county level standards and state level standards. So understandably, the owners in that county, the county government are concerned about the opportunity that could create for confusion, right? So we've been working very closely with our colleagues in Montgomery County government to see that we are linked as much as possible based on the writing of the law in Maryland to make this streamlined and sensible for the covered building owners, especially in Montgomery County. Meanwhile, we have other counties and jurisdictions in Maryland that have signed on to a national commitment saying that they're interested in developing building performance standards. So, you know, trying to coordinate this as carefully as possible to make it as easy as possible for our covered building owners to meet the requirements at local and state levels. Next slide. All right, and then finally, the schedule ahead. So today, providing this update, we hope to be able to present a proposed regulation to you in June. Following that would be a notice of proposed action in July, with public hearings following that. We may be on schedule to adopt regulations by the end of 2023. And, you know, something to acknowledge that this is a little bit later than the deadline that's specified in the Climate Solutions Now Act. We are working as hard and as fast as we can to try to meet these requirements to adopt regulations as quickly as possible. And I think that's my final slide. Oh, a little bit of contact information for you there, but otherwise happy to take any questions that you have.
Great job, Mark. Very informative. Anybody on the council have a comment or a question? Dr. Salwich.
Had to find the unmute button. Okay, thanks, Mark. Good to see you again virtually. I just had two simple questions. Early on, you talked about a 20% reduction, I think by 2030, but 20% relative to what? Just for that's my first question.
Yeah, so the law says that a covered building has to achieve a 20% reduction from 2025 levels of average buildings of similar construction. And where the modeling activity that we've done here, that LBNL has done, is had to project what is energy consumption going to look like in 2025. You know, fortunately, energy consumption doesn't change that dramatically. You know, we can take energy consumption data from recent years and pretty reliably predict what energy consumption in 2025 is going to look like, because the pace of change isn't that rapid. So the model has assumed an energy consumption profile in 2025, and then the law says that from that level there needs to be a 20% reduction from the average of buildings of similar construction. That's the writing of the law.
Okay, great. And my second question, I think it was around slide 12. You had a chart showing pretty minuscule methane emissions. And does this include heating? I mean, I just would have thought that shopping centers and whatnot use combustion of fossil fuel in boilers or furnaces. So I assume you're looking at heating, and I'm just really surprised to see the natural gas so small if this does include heating. So it's a question, I guess.
Yeah, so couple factors in there. One is that the vast majority, and you can see it on the left side here, the vast majority of energy consumed in buildings is electrical. So it's just when we look at the natural gas consumption or on-site fuel use, coupled with the total energy consumption from electric consumption, it gets a little bit, you know, lost in the numbers just because of its relative size. You know, the other factor here is that we have an estimated 25% of buildings in Maryland, covered buildings, that are already all electric or are using a very, very small amount of direct fuel. So that is perhaps also feeding into these numbers to minimize actually the amount of natural gas or other fuels. And I keep on saying natural gas because the analysis is also showing that for covered buildings, the vast majority of fuel use that they're direct fuel that they're using on site is natural gas. There is of course some heating oil and propane used, but it's very, very small compared with the natural gas, and then the natural gas is very small compared to the electricity consumption of these buildings.
Thanks.
If I might, Mark, just put it in perspective for us. There's no action from this. There's already a process in place, and it's going to be completed in the fall, correct? Could you just talk about a little bit about the process?
Yeah, well, I might turn that to Chris or Randy to talk about process ahead, because frankly, this is my first rulemaking at MDE. So they're better than I would be to talk about what's ahead for AQCAC.
We decided to throw Mark in the deep end with his first rulemaking, but the big complicated one. No action today. This is a briefing. Hopefully in June, it'll be an action item when we'll have the whole proposed regulation for you all to consider, and then that'll be the action.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments, Dr. Latshaw?
So I've been on the periphery of some of the conversations at Johns Hopkins about this, and I feel like one of their biggest concerns is can the grid handle it? Is that something that you guys are talking about?
Yes, so we talk a lot about that here, because when we talk about the state strategies to reduce GHG emissions, and again, linking back to the conversation that you all had in the first hour, a lot of that looks like electrification of vehicles and buildings. But it's important to also look at the energy savings potential from energy efficiency. So I forget which slide it is, but Kelsey or Randy, whoever's steering it, if you can go to the one that shows how electricity consumption decreases pretty significantly. Actually, you just scrolled past it. Let's see, slide 12. So what we see is that we have, by focusing on, of course, electrifying our fossil fuel end uses, but also coupled with overall energy efficiency goals, we see a significant decrease. This model is projecting, based on a number of assumptions, a 44% reduction in electricity consumption from covered buildings. When we look at energy use in homes and seeing what's happening also with overall energy efficiency in the residential sector, we're also seeing the great opportunity for electrical savings there. That said, a lot of the grid concerns are about what happens in just those coldest hours of the year, or in sometimes the hottest hours of the year, when the electric consumption is the greatest, right? And that is the subject of much study. The utilities, BGE has done excellent work looking at those issues, as of PEPCO and the other utilities. There's a process at the Public Service Commission right now, an electrification study looking at the impacts of economy-wide electrification and how all of these things fit together, and ensuring, of course, this is one of PSC's mandates, the Public Service Commission's mandates, to make sure that we are all managing the grid well, so that we continue to have one of the most reliable electric grids in the country. And that's a priority for all of us: affordability, reliability, and minimizing our impact on the environment.
Great, thanks.
I might comment from BG on that. The grid is not adequate to deal with this, but we can build it to be adequate in the time frame if we work cooperatively and if we're all aware of what's going on. It's a lot. We might even quadruple peak demand in the overall scheme of getting to 2045. So it's a lot of work and a lot of analysis, but we're working together to make sure we can all get there together, and we support it. Mr. Schoen, go ahead.
Yeah, so these are, I mean, it's great to have these standards. I totally support them. I think it'll move us to where we need to go with regard to greenhouse gas emissions and extraction and other issues. I'm going to put my plug in again for what this misses. This misses the transportation and land use impacts of buildings. There's still some 40% of our energy goes on transportation. And even if we go to fully electric vehicles, we're still going to have the issues of congestion on the roads, paving over land for transportation arteries, which we continue to do development that relies on private automobiles to transport from one place to another. You have paving over land for parking. So this is great, but I've always encouraged us to look more broadly at the transportation-related issues from development that we continue to allow, especially compared to other nations in the world. We're totally dependent on automobiles for transportation. Doesn't impact my support for this initiative, but I just like us to broaden our thinking. Thank you.
I agree, Larry.
Any other comments from council members? Is there anyone from the public that asked to speak on this issue?
Yes, we do have one person. Louisa, if you'd like to speak.
Thank you. This is Louise Ritu with Baltimore County Government, and I'm also on the Building Energy Transition Implementation Task Force. I have a question concerning the covered buildings. I see that you're parsing the data as far as the building use. Have you had an opportunity yet to look at the building ownership, realizing that, say, state and local government have different procurement requirements and concerns, and then, say, nonprofits, colleges and universities, retail, people are going to be approaching these things differently, and that's something that we're going to have to be concerned about when we see how people are going to be implementing it.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, and also for flagging that there's a process called the Building Energy Transition Implementation Task Force that MDE is called on in the Climate Solutions Now Act to stand up. We plan to launch that in the next few months, and it will have to recommend the incentives that need to be made available, the financial mechanisms that will be available from the state to help the owners of covered buildings and the owners of other buildings achieve the goals of the Climate Solutions Now Act. I think it's front and center in my mind, coming from sort of facilities management in the public sector, that the financing tools that are available in the public sector are different from the ones that are sometimes available in the private sector. There's a lot of overlap, but there are important differences. So that is something that I'm bringing into that task force conversation. And Luisa, I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunity for the task force to think through those issues and to bring next fall forward the recommendations on how to make these standards workable for every type of building owner in the state.
Any other comments or questions? Thanks again, Mr. Stewart. Great job. I guess I'm turning it back to Chris if there's anything else we want to cover today.
That takes us through the agenda. So I think we may be able to adjourn here a little bit early. I'd like to thank our chair, John Quinn, our co-chair, Todd Chasen, members of the council. Special thanks to all of the cats, Todd and Ben's cats, for their careful attention to the material to complement the engagement by the human members of the council. I'll make one note and then I'll turn it over to you, John, to bring us home. For everyone's awareness, this afternoon, the governor is planning to discuss clean cars and the action that you all approved today at an event laying out his vision for climate change and the role of electric vehicles in addressing climate change and also improving air quality in overburdened communities. So keep an eye out in the news for that and the impacts of your important work.
And I want to remind people that we have meetings scheduled for June 12th, September 11th, and December 11th. So you should mark those mornings on your calendar because we really have good attendance. Let's keep it up. Chris, do you know what that event is the governor's speaking at?
Yep, so he'll be holding a press event here at MDE discussing clean cars. Our secretary, Serena McElwain, will host it. We'll also hear remarks from Baltimore Mayor Scott and members of the business and NGO community about the importance of, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 action, but also more broadly, transportation decarbonization.
It's good to have your boss back in what you're doing, isn't it?
It does help sometimes, yeah.
Brad, I don't have anything else. Anybody else on the council want to say any last words? Dr. Salwich?
Thanks all for a great meeting. I apologize for probably speaking too much. Chris, will Governor Moore's event be streamed?
I don't know. It is open press, so we'll see which news outlets carry it. But we don't have any streaming built in here.
Thanks.
And my last comment is the presentation materials will all be sent out, correct?
Correct, John. They're already on the MDE website as we speak. We will send it to the council.
I appreciate that. All right, I move to adjourn. We're done. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Have a good one.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.